The courtroom was silent as Judge Evelyn Carter sat behind her desk, staring at the envelope that had just been placed in front of her. Across from her, Charles Whitman, a billionaire businessman, leaned back in his chair, a smug smirk on his face. "Consider it a token of appreciation, Your Honor," he said smoothly, his fingers adjusting the cuffs of his tailored suit. The envelope, thick with $100 bills, sat untouched on the polished wooden surface. Whitman was confident. He had bought his way out of trouble before. Why should this time be any different? He chuckled. A little gesture between professionals. "I'm sure you understand." Judge Carter didn't blink. Slowly, she reached forward and pressed a small button under her desk. The door swung open. A uniformed officer stepped inside. Whitman's smirk vanished. Because what he didn't know, he had just made the worst mistake of his life. The air inside Judge Evelyn Carter's chambers was still, almost suffocating. The rich scent of polished wood and aged leather filled the space, but at this moment, the atmosphere felt poisoned by the thick envelope sitting on her desk. The weight of what had just happened pressed down on the room like an invisible force. Across from her, Charles Whitman, a billionaire businessman, sat with his legs crossed, exuding the kind of overconfidence that only came with years of getting away with everything. He was in his late 50s, with neatly combed silver hair and a jawline carved by vanity and power. His suit was custom-tailored. His cufflinks gleamed under the soft lighting, and his smirk was that of a man who had never heard the word no. Judge Carter, in contrast, was the embodiment of discipline and integrity. In her mid-50s, she carried herself with a quiet, commanding presence. Her short-cropped hair framed a face that had seen it all. Decades of trials, criminals, and, most disgustingly, people like Whitman, who thought the law was just another business deal. She had earned her seat on the bench through sheer hard work, and she had no patience for corruption. Whitman tapped the arm of his chair as if bored. "Come on, Your Honor," he said, his voice rich with amusement. "Let's not make this complicated. We both know how things work." Carter remained silent, her fingers lightly resting on the desk, just inches away from the envelope. The stack of bills inside was thick, easily tens of thousands of dollars. It was meant to be an easy fix to his current problem, a legal case that threatened his business empire. Whitman tilted his head, watching her carefully. "I've worked with many judges before, some more cooperative than others. Let's just say I reward my friends well." The arrogance in his voice made Carter's stomach turn. He truly believed he had already won. The room was dimly lit, the soft glow from a lamp casting long shadows across the walls. Outside, the courthouse hummed with activity. Lawyers preparing cases, clerks filing paperwork, officers escorting defendants to and from hearings. No one in the building knew what was happening in this room at that moment. No one, except Carter. And she was about to make sure that changed. Without looking at Whitman, she reached under her desk and pressed a small, hidden button. A sharp click echoed through the room as the heavy wooden door swung open. Officer Reynolds, the court's long-standing bailiff, stepped inside, his sharp eyes landing immediately on the envelope. He was a seasoned officer in his late 40s, built like a man who had spent decades keeping order in a courtroom. The moment he took in the scene, his posture stiffened. Whitman's smirk faltered. His fingers curled slightly, as if realizing too late that this wasn't going to go the way he had expected. Judge Carter finally spoke, her voice as steady as ever. "Officer Reynolds," she said, her tone giving away nothing. "Please stay in the room. We seem to have an issue at hand." Whitman's smile vanished completely. For the first time, he was no longer in control. The silence in the room stretched unbearably as Officer Reynolds took a measured step forward, his eyes scanning the scene with quiet precision. The thick envelope of cash still sat untouched on Judge Carter's desk, an ugly stain against the otherwise pristine wooden surface. Whitman, usually composed and confident, shifted slightly in his seat, though he quickly recovered, straightening his shoulders. Judge Carter leaned back in her chair, folding her hands together as she regarded the billionaire in front of her. "Tell me, Mr. Whitman," she said, her voice cool, but sharp enough to cut through the tension. "What exactly am I supposed to do with this?" Whitman chuckled, though it lacked the smooth arrogance he had displayed earlier. "It's just a gift, Your Honor," he said, his tone carefully casual. "A sign of goodwill. You see, my company provides thousands of jobs. People depend on me. I wouldn't want one misunderstanding to cause unnecessary damage." Carter's eyes narrowed slightly. "A misunderstanding?" Whitman nodded, spreading his hands. "That's all this is. The prosecution is blowing things out of proportion. My legal team tells me the case against me is weak, but you know how these things go. Sometimes it helps to have a friend in the right places." Reynolds let out a quiet scoff from where he stood, arms crossed over his broad chest. Judge Carter, however, didn't react. She simply studied Whitman as if he were a puzzle missing too many pieces. "So," she said slowly, "you believe justice is something that can be influenced?" Whitman smiled. "Justice is about perspective, Your Honor. And let's be honest, people like us, people with power, know how the world really works. It's not about what's right or wrong, it's about who has control." Carter let the words settle between them. Then, with a slow, deliberate motion, she reached for the envelope. She didn't open it. Instead, she held it up between two fingers before tilting her hand slightly. The bills slid out, fluttering onto her desk in a messy pile of corruption. Whitman's confidence flickered, his eyes darting briefly toward Officer Reynolds, who remained silent but watchful. Carter tapped a single finger against the stack of cash. "You have just committed a felony in a judge's chambers, Mr. Whitman," she said, her voice unwavering. "Attempting to bribe a judicial officer carries serious consequences. I assume, given your impressive wealth, you're aware of this." Whitman's smile tightened. "Come now, Judge. No need to make this dramatic. This is how things are done. Discreetly." Carter's lips pressed into a thin line. "Not in my courtroom." She reached under her desk again, pressing a second button. A moment later, the door swung open once more and two new figures entered. Attorney Susan Grant, the lead prosecutor in Whitman's fraud case, and Marcus Lane, Whitman's own defense attorney. Lane, a well-dressed but visibly stressed man in his late 40s, came to an abrupt halt the moment his eyes landed on the cash spread across the judge's desk. His face drained of color. "What?" Lane started, his voice barely above a whisper. "Tell me, you didn't just do this." Whitman's jaw tightened, but he remained seated. "Judge Carter is misunderstanding my intent," he said smoothly, but there was a strain in his voice now, the first sign that his confidence was unraveling. Grant, on the other hand, let out a low breath, shaking her head in disbelief. "Bribing a judge," she muttered. "You really are as arrogant as they say." Carter turned her attention to Whitman's lawyer. "Mr. Lane, I assume you are familiar with the ethical obligations of legal counsel. Your client has just attempted to corrupt this trial by offering a bribe. Do you intend to continue representing him?" Lane hesitated. His career was built on defending high-profile clients, even morally bankrupt ones. But this was different. He glanced at Whitman, then at the cash. His shoulders sagged slightly. "I'll need to have a word with my client. Privately." Carter nodded once. "You'll have time for that." For now, Officer Reynolds, please secure this evidence. Reynolds immediately stepped forward, pulling out an evidence bag and carefully placing the cash inside. Whitman watched, his fingers tightening into a fist against his knee. "Let me make something very clear," Judge Carter said, her voice cutting through the room like steel. "This court does not serve money. It does not serve power. It serves justice. And no amount of wealth will change that." Whitman exhaled through his nose, his smirk long gone. For the first time in his life, he had met someone he couldn't buy. But his problems weren't over yet, because the next move Judge Carter was about to make would leave him utterly speechless. Charles Whitman had spent his entire life buying his way out of problems. Every roadblock, every accusation, every legal hurdle, money had always been the solution. But now, for the first time, he was the one trapped. The room was still, the weight of Judge Carter's words settling heavily on everyone present. The pile of cash, now carefully sealed inside an evidence bag, sat in Officer Reynolds' firm grasp. Whitman cleared his throat, forcing himself to regain some composure. He straightened his tie, flashing his usual confident smirk. But it was weaker now, less certain. "Judge Carter," he began, his voice smooth but strained, "I think there's been a misunderstanding. That money was simply a gesture of goodwill, a donation, if you will. I never intended for it to be seen as anything inappropriate." Carter didn't even blink. "A donation," she repeated, tilting her head slightly. "You handed me an envelope full of cash in private after hours, while your case is still pending in my courtroom, and you expect me to believe this was an innocent act of generosity?" Whitman shrugged. "People support causes they believe in. I happen to believe in efficient legal proceedings." From the side, Susan Grant let out a sharp laugh. "Oh, that's rich. Efficient legal proceedings? That's your excuse?" Whitman shot her a glare but quickly turned back to Carter. "Your Honor, let's be reasonable here. We both know these cases can be complicated. I was simply trying to ensure fairness." Carter's expression didn't change. "Fairness," she echoed. Then, in a single, deliberate motion, she picked up the phone on her desk and dialed a number. Whitman's smirk faded entirely. "What are you doing?" he asked, his voice sharper now. Carter didn't answer. The line rang once, twice, before a voice answered on the other end. "FBI Field Office. Special Agent Callahan speaking." Whitman's entire body went rigid. Carter's gaze remained locked onto his. "Agent Callahan," she said calmly, "this is Judge Evelyn Carter of the State Superior Court. I need immediate assistance. I have a high-profile defendant who has just attempted to bribe a sitting judge." The reaction was instant. Whitman shot out of his chair, his face twisted in disbelief. "You're calling the FBI?" he sputtered. Carter held up a hand, signaling to Officer Reynolds, who immediately stepped forward, standing between Whitman and the desk. On the phone, Agent Callahan's voice was firm. "Did you say attempted bribery of a judge?" "I did," Carter confirmed. "I have the money secured as evidence. The defendant made the attempt inside my chambers in the presence of a court officer." "I'll have agents dispatched immediately," Callahan said. "Do not let him leave the premises." Whitman's jaw clenched. "Judge, this isn't necessary." Carter set the phone down, folding her hands neatly in front of her. "It's absolutely necessary, Mr. Whitman." His temper, barely held in check until now, finally snapped. "You have no idea who you're dealing with," he hissed, stepping forward. "Do you really think you can humiliate me like this? I have connections. I have resources. You think I'm going to prison?" Carter stood slowly, leveling him with an icy stare. "Yes." Whitman's breath hitched. "You are going to prison," she continued, "because for the first time in your life, You made a mistake you can't buy your way out of." His nostrils flared as he turned toward his own lawyer, Marcus Lane. "You need to fix this." Lane exhaled slowly, rubbing his temples. "I'm not sure there's anything to fix, Charles," he admitted. "Bribing a judge. That's a federal offense. If the FBI gets involved—" "If," Whitman snapped. "They're already involved." Susan Grant crossed her arms, shaking her head. "I have to say, Charles, this might be my easiest conviction yet." Before Whitman could respond, a loud knock echoed through the chamber doors. Officer Reynolds opened it, revealing 2 federal agents in dark suits. One of them, a tall man with a sharp, assessing gaze, stepped inside and pulled out his badge. "Agent Callahan, FBI. We were called about an attempted bribery?" Judge Carter nodded. "That's correct." Callahan turned his gaze to Whitman. "Charles Whitman, you are now under federal investigation for attempted bribery of a judge. You are to remain here while we process the charges." Whitman shook his head in disbelief, backing up slightly. "You can't be serious. This is absurd." Reynolds stepped forward, reaching for his cuffs. "Sir, place your hands behind your back." Whitman snapped. "No, you don't understand. I am not going to jail." His voice cracked with panic now. He turned back to Carter, his eyes wild. "You're making a mistake. You can't do this." Carter stepped around her desk, standing toe-to-toe with the billionaire. Her voice was quiet, but lethal. "The mistake was yours, Mr. Whitman. You believed justice was for sale." With that, she stepped back and gave Reynolds a small nod. The metallic click of the handcuffs echoed through the room as Whitman's hands were locked behind his back. His face burned with humiliation. The agents stepped forward, taking possession of the evidence bag with the cash. One of them turned to Carter. "Thank you for handling this properly, Your Honor. We'll take it from here." Carter nodded. "I trust you will." Whitman, still stunned, could only stand there as his entire world came crashing down. For the first time in his life, his money meant nothing, and that realization left him completely speechless. Charles Whitman stood frozen, his expensive suit now wrinkled from his struggle, his usually sharp gaze clouded with disbelief. The reality of his downfall was hitting him all at once. This wasn't how it was supposed to go. He had bribed dozens of officials before. Prosecutors, regulators, even judges. They had always taken the money and looked the other way. But this time, he had picked the wrong judge. The courtroom doors creaked open again, and another wave of murmurs rippled through the room. Reporters, court officials, and attorneys peered in, drawn by the commotion. Word of Whitman's arrest was already spreading like wildfire. The sight of the powerful billionaire in handcuffs sent shockwaves through everyone watching. Whitman's lawyer, Marcus Lane, let out a long sigh, rubbing his temples. "Judge Carter," he started, his voice tight, "there has to be another way to resolve this." Carter raised an eyebrow. "Another way?" she repeated, her voice even. Lane hesitated. He had been on Whitman's payroll for years, but even he knew when the situation was beyond salvaging. "My client is willing to cooperate," he said carefully. "Perhaps there's room for negotiation." Whitman snapped his head toward him. "Are you out of your mind?" he barked. "I don't negotiate like this." Lane pinched the bridge of his nose. "Charles, you bribed a judge. Do you have any idea how serious this is?" Judge Carter exchanged a knowing glance with Agent Callahan, who remained standing nearby, arms crossed. "Mr. Lane," she said, "your client didn't just attempt to bribe me. He did so while facing multiple felony charges. That's obstruction of justice, attempted corruption, possibly even conspiracy if we dig deeper." Whitman swallowed hard. He'd been so sure of himself, so confident that Judge Carter would take the money and handle the case the way every other corrupt official had done for him before. But now, he wasn't just facing fraud charges. He had made things exponentially worse. Agent Callahan pulled out a federal arrest warrant and began reading aloud. Charles Whitman, under federal law, you are charged with attempting to bribe a judicial official, obstruction of justice, and unlawful interference in court proceedings. Whitman let out a bitter laugh. Do you know how many people work for me? How much influence I have? He turned to Judge Carter. You think you're winning? You have no idea how many friends I have in high places. Carter's lips curled into a knowing smile. Friends? She repeated. She walked over to her desk, pulling out a thick file. Inside were documents, emails, wire transfers, evidence. Whitman's smirk vanished as he recognized the contents. We've been investigating you for months, Carter continued. You weren't as discreet as you thought. Whitman's chest tightened. He had been careful. He knew how to cover his tracks. But now, how did they have this much evidence? Agent Callahan took the file from Carter and flipped through it. Well, well, he muttered. Looks like we'll be adding a few more charges to your list. Whitman's knees nearly buckled. This wasn't just a bribery case. This was the end of everything, his entire empire. His businesses, his political connections, were all about to come crashing down. Judge Carter let the moment settle before delivering the final blow. You wanted to buy justice, Mr. Whitman, but all you did was sell yourself out. Whitman couldn't speak. For the first time in his life, money couldn't save him. And that realization left him completely and utterly speechless. The courtroom was no longer silent. The murmurs had turned into outright conversation, people whispering, exchanging glances and watching Charles Whitman, a man once feared and admired, now standing in handcuffs, powerless. His entire life had been built on one principle. Money controls everything. But today, in this courtroom, that belief had shattered. Judge Evelyn Carter remained standing, her posture unwavering, her eyes locked onto Whitman's. She saw something shift in his gaze, the slow realization that this wasn't just a temporary setback. This wasn't a fine he could pay, a deal he could negotiate. This was the end. Just outside the courthouse, reporters had already gathered, cameras flashing as news spread of the billionaire's bribery attempt. The story had exploded in real time with headlines flashing across news channels and social media. Breaking: billionaire Charles Whitman arrested for attempting to bribe a judge. Justice prevails. Corrupt tycoon faces consequences. Judge Carter exposes high-profile corruption case. FBI takes over investigation. Inside, Whitman's lawyer, Marcus Lane, let out a long sigh and finally spoke. Your Honor, he said, his voice quieter now. Given the new charges, I request a postponement of my client's trial so that we can reassess our defense strategy. Judge Carter didn't hesitate. Request denied. Lane blinked. Excuse me? Carter's voice was firm, unwavering. Your client has not only confirmed his guilt but has also attempted to corrupt this very courtroom. There will be no delays. The legal process will proceed as scheduled. Whitman gritted his teeth. His mouth opened as if to argue, but no words came out. The weight of what was happening had finally settled in. As the FBI agents led Whitman away, he heard the buzz of reporters just outside the courthouse, waiting to capture the moment he fell. The moment a billionaire, who once walked freely among politicians, business tycoons, and the elite, was escorted out in handcuffs like any other criminal. He had bribed, lied, manipulated, and for years it had worked. But today it had all fallen apart. His businesses frozen, his assets seized, his connections vanishing, his reputation destroyed. And for the first time in his life, no amount of money could fix it. As he was placed in the back of a black FBI vehicle, his eyes flickered toward Judge Carter, who remained standing in the courtroom watching. For a brief moment, he wondered, had he ever really stood a chance against her? The answer was painfully clear. Back in her chambers, Judge Carter took a deep breath. The weight of the moment was still settling in, but she felt no regret. Over the years, she had seen too many cases like this. Corrupt officials, wealthy criminals, people who thought the law was a game meant only for the weak. But today, justice had won. She sat down, looking at the now empty space on her desk where Whitman had placed the bribe. She thought about all the judges, prosecutors, and law enforcement officials who had taken bribes before him. How many had chosen greed over justice? But not her. Not today. A knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. It was Susan Grant, the prosecutor, stepping inside with a small but satisfied smile. "Not many people could have done what you did today," she said. Judge Carter simply shook her head. "I only did what was right," Grant chuckled. "That's the problem, Your Honor. Doing what's right isn't as common as it should be." Carter exhaled, leaning back in her chair. She thought about how today's case would be remembered, not just as another headline, but as a reminder that no one is above the law. Somewhere in the courtroom, a young law student had been watching today. Someone who would one day wear the robe, sit behind the bench, and make the same choice. And that was what mattered. Because true justice, it cannot be bought, and it never will be. Charles Whitman walked into that courtroom thinking he was untouchable. He believed money could solve everything. He believed justice was for sale. But today, he learned the hard way that true justice has no price. Judge Evelyn Carter didn't take the money. She didn't look the other way. Instead, she did what every judge, every official, and every person in power should do. She stood her ground. Because power isn't in wealth. It's in doing what's right. What would you have done in Judge Carter's place? Have you ever seen someone try to bribe their way out of trouble? Would you have spoken up? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If this story inspired you, don't keep it to yourself. Like, share, and subscribe for more powerful stories about justice, corruption, and the fight for what's right. Because at the end of the day, integrity isn't for sale. And those who try to buy their way out always pay the price. Whitman gritted his teeth. His mouth opened as if to argue, but no words came out. The weight of what was happening had finally settled in. As the FBI agents led Whitman away, he heard the buzz of reporters just outside the courthouse, waiting to capture the moment he fell. The moment a billionaire, who once walked freely among politicians, business tycoons, and the elite, was escorted out in handcuffs like any other criminal. He had bribed, lied, manipulated, and for years it had worked. But today it had all fallen apart. His businesses frozen, his assets seized, his connections vanishing, his reputation destroyed. And for the first time in his life, no amount of money could fix it. As he was placed in the back of a black FBI vehicle, his eyes flickered toward Judge Carter, who remained standing in the courtroom watching. For a brief moment, he wondered, had he ever really stood a chance against her? The answer was painfully clear. Back in her chambers, Judge Carter took a deep breath. The weight of the moment was still settling in, but she felt no regret. Over the years, she had seen too many cases like this. Corrupt officials, wealthy criminals, people who thought the law was a game meant only for the weak. But today, justice had won. She sat down, looking at the now empty space on her desk where Whitman had placed the bribe. She thought about all the judges, prosecutors, and law enforcement officials who had taken bribes before him. How many had chosen greed over justice? But not her. Not today. A knock at the door pulled her from her thoughts. It was Susan Grant, the prosecutor, stepping inside with a small but satisfied smile. "Not many people could have done what you did today," she said. Judge Carter simply shook her head. "I only did what was right," Grant chuckled. "That's the problem, Your Honor. Doing what's right isn't as common as it should be." Carter exhaled, leaning back in her chair. She thought about how today's case would be remembered, not just as another headline, but as a reminder that no one is above the law. Somewhere in the courtroom, a young law student had been watching today. Someone who would one day wear the robe, sit behind the bench, and make the same choice. And that was what mattered. Because true justice, it cannot be bought, and it never will be. Charles Whitman walked into that courtroom thinking he was untouchable. He believed money could solve everything. He believed justice was for sale. But today, he learned the hard way that true justice has no price. Judge Evelyn Carter didn't take the money. She didn't look the other way. Instead, she did what every judge, every official, and every person in power should do. She stood her ground. Because power isn't in wealth. It's in doing what's right. What would you have done in Judge Carter's place? Have you ever seen someone try to bribe their way out of trouble? Would you have spoken up? Share your thoughts in the comments below. If this story inspired you, don't keep it to yourself. Like, share, and subscribe for more powerful stories about justice, corruption, and the fight for what's right. Because at the end of the day, integrity isn't for sale. And those who try to buy their way out always pay the price.